You talk to yourself. You know you do. Maybe it's a running commentary while you make decisions. Maybe it's a full debrief after a conversation that ended hours ago. Maybe it's a quiet narration of your own experience that never quite stops, even when you wish it would. And somewhere along the way, someone made you feel like that was strange, like it was a sign of something slightly off. Psychology says the opposite. For highly sensitive people specifically, self-talk is not a quirk or a nervous habit. It is one of the most sophisticated cognitive tools the human brain produces, and the fact that yours runs so constantly tells you something important about how your mind was built and what it needs to function. 1. First, what highly sensitive actually means. In 1996, psychologist Dr. Elaine Aron identified a trait she called sensory processing sensitivity. Not a disorder, not a diagnosis, a trait present in approximately 20% of the human population and documented across over 100 species, which suggests it has survived because it carries genuine evolutionary value. Highly sensitive people are not simply people who cry at films or startle at loud noises. The core feature of the trait is depth of processing. The HSP brain does not take in information and move on. It pauses, it cross-references, it connects new information to existing memories, emotional context, prior experiences, potential future implications. It processes the same input more thoroughly, more completely, and more slowly than a non-HSP brain would. This is not weakness. It is a different processing architecture. One with significant advantages: heightened empathy, nuanced perception, strong pattern recognition, deep creativity. And one with a specific cost. The system processes so much that it can become overwhelmed by the volume of what it is handling, which is where the self-talk begins. 2. Self-talk is what an overloaded processing system does to manage its load. Think of your mind as a system that takes in more data than most. More sensory detail, more emotional nuance, more social information, more layers of meaning. The internal commentary, the voice that narrates, questions, analyzes, replays, is not a malfunction. It is the processing itself, made audible. When you replay a conversation after it ends, you are not being neurotic. You are completing a processing cycle your brain started but didn't have time to finish in real time. When you narrate your own decisions out loud or internally, you are not being indecisive. You are running a cross-check on a system that genuinely detects more variables than most people's brains register. When you talk yourself through a difficult moment, you are not being dramatic. You are using language as a regulatory tool, because for a highly sensitive nervous system, language gives structure to experience that would otherwise remain as undifferentiated overwhelm. Psychologists call this verbal elaboration. And research consistently shows that translating internal experience into language, even internal, unspoken language, significantly reduces the emotional intensity of that experience by activating the prefrontal cortex and partially deactivating the amygdala. Self-talk is, at the neurological level, one of the primary tools the brain uses to regulate itself. 3. There are two kinds of self-talk, and they do completely opposite things. Not all self-talk is the same, and for highly sensitive people, understanding the difference between these two types is not a minor point. It is the difference between a mind that functions as your most powerful tool and a mind that functions as your most persistent source of suffering. The first type is processing self-talk. This is the voice that observes, narrates, analyzes, and works through. It sounds like, "What is actually happening here?" Or, "What do I need right now?" Or, "That was hard, and here is what I think it meant." It moves. It resolves. It takes the overwhelming input your nervous system collected and converts it into something you can actually work with. When it finishes, there is a quality of landing, a sense of having arrived somewhere, even if that somewhere is simply clarity about what you're feeling. The second type is ruminative self-talk. This is the voice that circles. It replays without resolving. It returns to the same moment, the same conversation, the same fear, the same self-evaluation, not to process it, but to re-experience it. It sounds like certainty, but operates like a loop. It generates the sensation of thinking deeply while actually preventing the deeper processing from completing. And for highly sensitive people, whose brains are already primed to process thoroughly, rumination is a particular risk, because the same depth of processing that makes you perceptive in one mode makes the loop more consuming in the other. The distinction matters because highly sensitive people often blame themselves for the rumination when they should be recognizing it as a signal, not a character flaw, but an indicator that something in the processing cycle has gotten stuck and needs a different approach. 4. The voice that coaches and the voice that narrates are not the same as the voice that criticizes. Highly sensitive people typically develop a rich internal voice early in life, partly because the depth of their processing naturally generates internal commentary, and partly because many HSPs grew up in environments that were not built for them, environments that moved too fast, valued different things, treated their sensitivity as a problem to manage rather than a trait to understand. In those environments, a second voice often develops alongside the processing voice, a monitoring voice, one that checks whether you are too much, too intense, too emotional, too sensitive. One that preemptively edits your experience before you express it. One that has learned to translate your inner world into a form more acceptable to the outer one. This monitoring voice often sounds like self-awareness, but functions like self-surveillance. And the distinction matters because self-awareness helps you understand yourself more clearly, while self-surveillance helps you hide yourself more effectively. They can feel identical from the inside. They have completely different effects on your nervous system over time. One of the central tasks for a highly sensitive person is learning to distinguish between these voices: the processing voice that helps, the coaching voice that guides, and the monitoring voice that was never yours to begin with. 5. Talking to yourself in the third person changes what it does to your brain. This is one of the most specific and actionable findings in the psychology of self-talk, and it is particularly relevant for highly sensitive people. Research by psychologist Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan found that when people shift from first-person self-talk, "I am overwhelmed, I can't handle this, why did I say that?" to third-person self-talk, "She is overwhelmed right now, what does she need?" something measurable changes in the brain. Psychological distance increases, emotional flooding decreases, the prefrontal cortex re-engages. The person becomes, in effect, their own wise external observer rather than a fully immersed participant in the experience. For highly sensitive people, who are already highly immersed in their own internal experience by the nature of the trait, this shift in pronoun is not a small technique. It is a structural change in how the brain processes emotional information. It creates enough distance to allow the depth of processing to work for you rather than on you. It is the difference between being consumed by the experience and being curious about it. 6. The internal monologue is not a symptom. It is a signal. When your self-talk is running, when the internal voice is active, narrating, questioning, replaying, it is easy to interpret that as a sign that something is wrong, that you are too anxious, too sensitive, too in your head, that other people do not do this and you should find a way to stop. But the volume of your internal monologue is, in most cases, a direct reflection of the volume of what your nervous system is processing. It goes up when the input increases, when environments are overstimulating, when emotional complexity is high, when something important is unresolved. It goes down when you have been given enough quiet, enough space, enough time to actually complete the processing cycles that the stimulation started. Trying to silence the self-talk without addressing what's generating it is like turning off the low oil warning light in your car without adding oil. The signal disappears. The problem doesn't. What highly sensitive people need is not less internal voice. It is a better relationship with the voice they have. Learning to hear it as information rather than noise. Learning to ask it the right questions rather than trying to shut it down. Learning to recognize when it is processing versus when it is looping, and knowing the difference between those two states in your own body. 7. You were not built wrong. You were built for depth. The self-talk, the replaying, the analysis, the internal narration that never quite stops. This is not a malfunction in a standard issue brain. This is a standard feature in a brain built to process deeply, perceive widely, and feel fully. It has costs. The costs are real and they are not nothing. Overstimulation is real. Overwhelm is real. The exhaustion of processing more than most people around you register is real. But so is the precision, the empathy, the capacity to notice what others miss, to feel what others cannot access, to understand at a depth that most people are simply not equipped for. You are not broken. You are running different software. Software that requires more processing time, more internal space, more deliberate management of input and output, and which, when those conditions are met, produces something that cannot be replicated by any other architecture. The voice in your head is not the problem. It is the instrument. The only question is whether you have learned to play it or whether you have spent all this time wishing it would stop. Tell me, when you catch yourself talking to yourself, what is the voice usually doing? Processing, coaching, looping, or something you don't have a word for yet? And if you want to understand exactly what happens in the highly sensitive nervous system when it reaches its limit, why the shutdown comes, what it actually is, and whether it can be changed, the next video goes somewhere most people aren't ready to look. Click it.